Welcome to another edition of the News Review. In this edition, Japan's Prime Minister has called on the U.S. and Europe to act in unison with Tokyo against China as a key challenge. Fumio Kishida says his country will never allow any attempt by China to unilaterally change the existing international order by force. Kishida says Tokyo remains concerned about China's military activities in the East China Sea, and it will reinforce its defense capabilities. Kishida, who earlier met with the country's President Joe Biden during the meeting, said that Washington remains committed to the alliance to Tokyo, and also the U.S. President said that Japan's recent announcement of its largest military overhaul since World War II made Washington happy. Earlier, Beijing slammed the U.S. and Japan for what they call a war mentality and groundless attacks on China.
China urges the United States and Japan to abandon a Cold War mentality and ideological bias, stop creating imaginary enemies and replicating the mindset of the new Cold War mentality in the Asia-Pacific, and refrain from becoming countercurrents that destabilize the Asia-Pacific region.
Now, Wang added that the U.S. and Japan talk about promoting regional peace and security, but rather they seek to execute their military buildup and militarization. He made these remarks after the U.S. and Japan signed a defense agreement following talks between their foreign and defense ministers in Washington. They described China as the greatest strategic challenge in the two Pacific and in the Indo-Pacific, that is, and beyond. Now, to discuss that further, we are joined by William Jones, Executive Intelligence Review from Leesburg, and Matthew Ehret, a political analyst who's joining us live from Montreal. Let's begin with Mr. William Jones. How serious do you see the military buildup in the South China Sea, and do you predict any escalations?
Well, this is an extremely dangerous situation. What you're looking at here is an attempt to create really a global NATO. It looks like the U.S. and alliance, which is primary. Japanese for the last years, just prior is going to spend time in Europe talking to the British, and also mention terms as their operation on the military angle. So what you're seeing is that NATO should ban and intends to maintain the rules making in Europe. It's now making moves into the Pacific region, in Asia Pacific. And it's aimed against China, but it's also aimed against Russia. What the Japanese are doing, of course, is using this as a wedge to reassert their primary role in the Asia Pacific, which they feel that they have lost through the loss of in World War II. And so they're piggybacking on the U.S. need for these major alliances in order to put a front against China in order to boost their own role in the region. That is, although they're in very much close contact with the United States, the Japanese have their own agenda for the Asia Pacific, and it reflects some of what we've seen historically in the last century as well. So it's a very dangerous development. The Chinese are taking it very seriously, probably more seriously than the statement by Wang Wenbin today.
Okay, so Mr. Ehret, you just heard Mr. Jones. How serious do you see the situation? And do you believe that we should be expecting any kind of escalation anytime soon?
Well, I was only able to somewhat hear some of Mr. Jones's contributions, so if I repeat anything, I apologize, but it is indeed extremely serious and dire. The fact is that it's not simply about Japan per se, but rather the entire encirclement, the containment of China, of which there are 100,000 US troops in the Pacific in China's backyard, South Korea, Japan, massively conducting saber rattling, and this has been going on since the Asia pivot was really launched by Obama, which has been taken up in full force. And so, as Mr. Jones has said, there is a targeting of both Russia as well as China, and those who are pushing this policy, and especially getting Japan to let go of Article 9 in its pacifist constitution in order to allow for Japan to carry out an offensive strike in the context of its allies being threatened, which is very, very ambiguous. This is immensely dangerous, and the weapons, the long and the medium and long range missiles that are also being invested in by Japan in this context is extremely dangerous ideologically for China and for the rest of the world.
Okay, so Mr. Jones, how do you see the future considering the reactions that we've seen from the U.S. and Japan?
Well, basically, this is an offensive operation of the U.S. detriment to retain a role which Japan, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, really as the single superpower. But that role is now in the past. China is a major player, is one of the biggest trading partner in the world today. The world economy is more dependent upon what China does, what decisions they make, than really what the U.S. decides. And most of the world realizes that. China has also built up a great deal of goodwill in the world generally, particularly in the developing countries, who are more or less opposed or very skeptical of the U.S. moves to reassert their so-called hegemony. So the U.S. has a tremendous amount of military power, especially through this grouping of alliances, or what you would call the global NATO. But it's not clear how far that's going to go. They're having trouble in Europe now because of the conflict in Ukraine, which the United States is continuing to push in order to whittle down Russia somewhat. And in the Asia Pacific region, most countries are concerned about getting out of this COVID pandemic and getting back to economic activity. In that respect, China and its opening up and its reduction of the COVID restrictions that we've seen in the last couple of days has created a tremendous amount of enthusiasm. So you have good signs coming out of there, and I think a lot of goodwill for China and opposition to this attempt to create a new Cold War on the part of most of the world. But the way that this is being done now can lead to a major military conflict if it's pushed too far, as we have seen it has been in Europe. The same thing can also happen in the Asia Pacific, but I think that cooler heads will prevail, and that the countries in the Asia Pacific region are not in favor of military conflict, and would, in that sense, support China in its attempt to try and bring down the tensions considerably.
So, Mr. Ehret, you just heard Mr. Jones's comments. I hope that you heard them completely this time. Last time we had some technical difficulties, of course. So, Mr. Ehret, as Mr. Jones mentioned, hegemony is the name of the game the U.S. is playing. On the other hand, China is asking the U.S. and Japan to let go of that Cold War mentality. Do you believe that the U.S. will ever give up that that will to be in a unipolar world where it can say that the U.S. is calling the shots?
Well, I think if the United States is to survive the coming storm, which in many cases it's brought onto itself, it will be because it rediscovers its lost or its forgotten heritage, which once put the emphasis upon win-win cooperation and looking for the benefit of our neighbors in the context of mutual economic development, which we saw with the foreign policy outlook of people like John F. Kennedy, like Franklin Roosevelt, like many of the great Americans who tend to get assassinated while in office. However, I mean, China today has really taken up that torch of a win-win philosophy, and I think that's one of the best points of salvation for the nations of the world in this time of crisis. So certainly China has always emphasized the importance of cooperation around things like the regional comprehensive economic partnership, which amongst those nations of the Pacific, this is one of the biggest and most important free trade agreement zones in the world, but tied to China's emphasis on building real infrastructure, building and increasing the productive powers of labor of society. And amongst the ASEAN countries, China's trade has increased in 2022 by a factor of 15%. So China has a lot to offer the nations, especially those who are being used as disposable battering rams by Anglo-American proxies, including Japan, which could win a lot, especially on mutual development in the Arctic and the Russian zone, and many other trade agreements. Taiwan could benefit enormously, as could every country, including the United States, if they chose to really think about their genuine, authentic self-interest instead of holding on to this delusion of hegemony and unipolarism, which is not just killing the world, but it's also killing Americans. So yes, I believe that America, I'm an optimist, and I'm living in North America, so I do hope that we are able to rediscover our sanity fast.
Okay, so that was Matthew Ehret, political analyst from Montreal, and William Jones, exec from the Intelligence Review, the Executive Intelligence Review from Leesburg. Thank you very much to both of you gentlemen for sharing your thoughts and views on this edition of the News Review. And thanks to all of you viewers for watching this edition.